October 14th, 1943, 20,000 feet over Germany. For the men of the 8th Air Force, this patch of sky had a name, the Killing Zone. They flew in the B-17 Flying Fortress, a marvel of engineering bristling with 13 50 caliber machine guns. It was designed to defend itself, to fly in tight formations that could create a wall of lead. But it wasn't enough. Their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, powerful but short-legged fighters, had reached the limit of their fuel tanks and turned back. Now 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses were alone, deep inside Germany, and the Luftwaffe knew exactly where the protection ended. They waited, climbing high in the sun, ready to pounce the moment the little friends departed. By day's end, 60 bombers were shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured. It was the single worst day of the American bombing campaign, a massacre that would be remembered as Black Thursday. The math was brutal. A combat tour was 25 missions. At this loss rate, bomber crews had a 25% chance of surviving. They were losing the air war, and they were running out of men willing to fly into what seemed like certain death. Meanwhile, in California, a different kind of pressure was being applied at the North American Aviation factory. Led by chief designer Edgar Schmood, a team of engineers had faced an impossible request from the British nearly 2 years earlier: design and build a brand new fighter plane. The deadline, just 117 days. They did it. The P-51 Mustang was born. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamic design, fast, beautiful, a pilot's dream. But it had a fatal flaw, a secret hidden under its sleek cowling. Above 15,000 feet, the very altitude where the air war over Europe was fought, its American-made Allison engine gasped for air. The engine supercharger, crucial for forcing air into the engine in the thin atmosphere, was designed for low-level performance. At high altitude, the Mustang couldn't climb, couldn't maneuver, and couldn't fight. Against the finely tuned German fighters, it was useless, so thousands were built. Millions of dollars were spent, and none of it mattered for saving the bomber crews. The plane that was supposed to help win the air war couldn't breathe where the air war was being fought. Then, in April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker was given a flight in a new Allison-powered Mustang. He saw what others had missed. He saw past the flawed engine and recognized the genius of the airframe. He wrote a simple, world-changing report that concluded with a revolutionary idea. This aircraft would be exceptional with a Merlin engine. The Merlin, the legendary British engine that powered the iconic Spitfire. The engine that had screamed in the skies over London and saved Britain in 1940. Harker was proposing an engineering heresy, to rip the American heart out of an American fighter and replace it with a British one. The politics were ugly. American manufacturers didn't want to admit their engine was inferior. The Army Air Forces were resistant. British factories were already stretched to their absolute limit, building every Merlin they could for their own Spitfires and Lancasters. But the bomber losses over Germany kept mounting. A torrent of blood and shattered aircraft. The crisis forced their hand, so they took the gamble. In a small, almost secret project, engineers were tasked with creating a hybrid. They built 5 experimental Mustangs with Merlin engines. November 13th, 1942. Test pilot Bob Chilton strapped into the cockpit of the hybrid aircraft. The ground crew watched nervously. He took off, and the difference was immediate. He climbed to 20,000 feet, the altitude where Allison Mustangs wheezed and struggled. The Merlin sang a song of effortless power. He pushed higher, 25,000 feet, 30,000 feet. The plane was still climbing, still performing beautifully. When he landed, he climbed out of the cockpit with a huge grin. He said 3 words that would echo through the entire war. This changes everything. January 11th, 1944. The first mass combat deployment of the new Merlin-powered P-51B Mustangs. The target, Oschersleben, Germany, deep in the killing zone. In the briefing rooms, B-17 crews listened with the same tense silence as before. They had heard rumors of new fighters, of planes with longer range, but they had heard promises before. The bombers formed up, with P-47 Thunderbolts taking up their familiar positions alongside them. But as they crossed into Germany, the moment of dread arrived. The P-47s reached their limit, waggled their wings in salute, and turned for home. As the P-47s left, the old fear returned. They were alone, except this time they weren't. Out of the high sun, new, sleek fighters appeared. Silver, fast. They slid into formation beside the bombers. They were Mustangs, and they kept coming. They stayed with the bombers all the way to the target, and all the way back. When the Luftwaffe rose to attack, they expected to find helpless targets. Instead, they ran headfirst into a storm of angry fighters. The shock to the German pilots was profound.
We weren't just flying
Their reign of
fighters.
terror was over.
We
In
were
that
bringing
first
boys
month,
home.
American bomber losses dropped by half. By March, they had fallen by 2/3. Lieutenant James McCubbin, flying one of those early escorts, remembered looking over at a B-17 and seeing the crew in the waist windows waving at him. They were crying. And that's when I understood, he said later. We weren't just flying fighters. We were bringing boys home. The Mustangs didn't just protect. They began to hunt. A new aggressive directive came down from the commander of the 8th Air Force, the legendary General Jimmy Doolittle. He ordered his pilots to be more than just bodyguards. His order was simple: attack enemy fighters aggressively. Go after them everywhere. Strafe their airfields. The Luftwaffe had owned German skies for years. Now they were prey. Even their new wonder weapons, the revolutionary, jet-powered Messerschmitt Me 262, were vulnerable. On one mission, Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew spotted two Me 262 jets returning to their base. He knew the jets were nearly untouchable at full speed, but they were sluggish and slow to respond while landing. He dove his Mustang on them, and in a single audacious engagement, shot down both jets, the fastest aircraft in the world, caught vulnerable by a piston engine fighter. It became a standard tactic for Mustang pilots. The German ace Adolf Galland later wrote, "The arrival of the Mustang changed everything. Before we could choose when and where to fight. After January 1944, we fought when they chose. And they chose every day all over our homeland. This new superiority came at a price. The Mustang pilots were now the tip of the spear, flying into the heart of the German defenses. The cost was real. 2,520 Mustangs were lost in combat over Europe. 2,520 pilots who didn't come home. Superiority didn't mean invulnerability. Back in the United States, an army of civilians worked around the clock. In total, 6974 P-51 Mustangs were built. At peak production, North American's factory in Inglewood completed one every hour. The American Merlin engines were built under license by the Packard Motor Car Company. The planes themselves were built by women like May Creer, Rosie the Riveters, who worked tirelessly while their husbands, brothers and sons flew them into combat. Years later, May Creer met a former P-51 pilot at an air show. With tears in his eyes, he took her hand and told her, "You built the plane that brought me home." And that was the count that truly mattered. Before the Merlin Mustangs arrived, the 8th Air Force was losing 50 to 60 bombers on a single deep mission. That was 500 to 600 men. After the Mustangs took over the escort duties, the average dropped to 10 to 15 bombers. By conservative estimates, the Mustang escorts saved over 15,000 bomber crew lives between January 1944 and May 1945. That is 15,000 sons, husbands and fathers who got to go home. All because someone figured out how to put the right engine in the right airframe at exactly the right time. Today, the P-51 Mustang is a legend. Vintage aircraft sell for millions of dollars. But for the men who flew them, and for the men they protected, it was never about nostalgia or glamour. In 1945, B-17 pilot Robert Morgan, the same man who had written "We're all dead men flying" after the Schweinfurt disaster, returned home after completing his 25 missions. When a reporter asked him what changed between the dark days of 1943 and the victory of 1945, his answer was immediate: Mustangs. Knowing they were there all the way, the air war was won by many factors: courage, strategy, and industrial might. But it was won by men too. It was won by the men in the B-17s who kept flying into the heart of hell day after day. It was won by the men in the P-51s who went with them. And it was won because one man looked at an almost great aircraft and saw what it could truly become. The P-51 Mustang didn't just kick Hitler out of the sky. It brought our boys home. And that's why, 85 years later, we still remember it. Not because it was the fastest or the deadliest, but because when it mattered most, it was there.